All right, well then with that said, we can talk about the digestive system. Once again, this is our last lecture, although it's a singular lecture, it will be a 40-question lecture because there's so much to discuss. Just one blank on this page. All right, the main organs of the digestive system form a tube that goes all the way through our thoracic and abdominal cavities of our body. We refer to this tube as the gastrointestinal tract, or GI tract for short. Also goes by the term alimentary canal, although you'll never hear me call it that. I usually just call it GI tract for short. Okay. This tract extends all the way from our mouth to the anus and includes obviously the mouth, but also the pharynx, which we just talked about, the esophagus, the stomach, and then the small and the large intestines. Okay. But those are not the only organs that are part of the digestive system. You also have accessory organs that do not perform any digestion or absorption, but assist in the processes. And those include your teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. All of those are pretty darn associated with our mouth. Then you've got the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, which are going to produce substances that help with digestion. And we'll get into those kind of the back half of the lecture. As a whole, your tracts, just the organs of the tract, that tract is about 5 to 7 meters or 16.5 to 23 feet in length in a living person. Obviously, there's nobody walking around that's 16.5 to 23 feet tall, which tells you that it's not just a straight shot from our mouth to our anus. Instead, there's a lot of twisting and turning, and a good portion of that actually is just from the small intestine, which is kind of misleading. Small intestine, you would think, is a small organ. It's actually the longest organ of the body, but it is a small tube, which is where its name comes from. It's long, but it's kind of skinny, if you want to think of it that way. Okay. Embryologically, the tract forms from a tube-like structure that develops outpouchings. These outpouchings evolve into the attached digestive organs, and that includes the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Within the tract, there are stored sites, excretion sites, and detoxifying sites that we'll discuss. When food is passing through the lumen or the internal cavity of our tract, it's technically still outside of our body. So if you had some breakfast this morning and that breakfast is now kind of sloshing around in your stomach and moving down into your small intestine, it's technically not internal, which seems kind of weird. But when that food is broken down to the point where it can be absorbed through the walls and into the blood or the lymphatic system, then it actually enters the body. Now, some things we absorb really quickly. For example, we actually start like absorbing alcohol in minutes, and that's because it starts to be absorbed in the stomach. But for a lot of things, the absorption doesn't take place for a few hours once it makes its way into the small intestine. Okay. As a whole, the function of the digestive system includes the transportation of food and water and the modifying of that food and water to make them suitable for absorption and excretion. So to get that food suitable for absorption and excretion, we perform the following treatment processes. It all begins with the process of eating, that's ingestion. Okay, taking a bite out of your food, chewing it up, that's all eating. Propulsion is the movement of food along the GI tracts through the process known as peristalsis, a series of alternating contractions and relaxations of muscle that lines the walls of our digestive organs. And the key with propulsion or peristalsis, is that it moves the food forward only. This is the major means of moving food through the GI tract, and that's very different than what we'll learn out about with segmentation here in a second. Okay. This process begins once we've chewed that food up and we swallow it. Okay. And then that continues all the way down to the point where it's at the other end and we're ready to push it out of the body through defecation. Okay. Now, to help with that movement and to help with digestion, we're going to secrete lots and lots and lots of fluids, lots and lots of different substances from cells or glands. And those can be physiologically active substances like enzymes that help break down the food. It could be mucus that just helps give the food some lubrication so it's easier to swallow. And we'll find out all about the different things that we secrete in our GI tract throughout this lecture. Okay. There's actually two different forms of digestion that we perform. mechanical and chemical. Mechanical digestion is actually simpler. It's just where we physically break down food into smaller pieces. So it's like chopping stuff up, and it therefore is easier to digest chemically. Okay. This process of mechanical digestion begins with chewing of our food. You think about like cartoons like Scooby-Doo, which my boys like to watch. Watch Scooby and Shaggy swallow, hoagie sandwiches in one bite. We can't do that. At least I don't know anybody that can. We have to take small bites and chew that up, grind it up. That will continue with the muscular turning of the stomach through a process known as segmentation. Okay. Segmentation is a series of muscular contractions of the intestinal wall, similar to peristalsis, except that the rhythmic timing of the muscle, when it contracts, forces food forward and backward rather than forward only. So in doing so, it pushes some of that food forward, some of it goes backwards, and in doing so, that makes it smaller, and those pieces therefore are much more easily chemically digested. If you want to kind of think of differences between peristalsis and segmentation, think about the ways that you can squeeze a toothpaste tube. The way that I do it, which is the correct way, and then the way that my wife does it, which is the incorrect way. And if you're married, you understand these types of things. I like to grab the toothpaste from the opposite side of the cap, and I always try to push it towards the cap. That's what peristalsis is. You're always pushing it in one direction. My beautiful, lovely wife grabs the toothpaste tube like a gorilla and just squeezes. It doesn't matter where it's at, and so that just negates all the work that I do. She gets the tube to squirt the toothpaste out on one side, and then the toothpaste also goes back to the other side. She's performing segmentation. Okay. Now, the whole reason that we mechanically digest is so that it helps us perform chemical digestion. This is a much more sophisticated, complicated process where we're breaking things down using chemical reactions. Okay? And this involves enzymes that we produce and are released into the stomach and small intestine. And it is all stuff I wouldn't get into in this class, but I do talk about in physiology. So those of you in that class get to look forward to that. Okay. And the entire reason that we do any eating and drinking is, if you want to think of it at the basic level, we do it because we're hungry and we're thirsty, but it's a desire to get the things into our body that we can't produce. And those could be, simple as water, could be as, complex as vitamins and minerals, amino acids and carbohydrates. And we bring those in so that we can absorb them, move those molecules from the tract to adjacent blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, either through passive diffusion or active transport. And unfortunately, we can't absorb everything. So anything that's undigested, any extra fluid that gets pushed out into the tract gets defecated out. We all know what that is, the process of pooping. Okay. Got a nice view here from a cadaver of their abdomen where we can see a good number of those organs, very visible liver, the largest internal organ. We can see a little bit of the stomach right here. We can see part of the colon, which is part of the large intestine. We can see a good portion of the small intestine. All those squiggly parts in there are small intestine. Over on the left side is just an animated version where we can actually trace all the way back up to the head, so we can see the mouth and the parts of that. You can see things are color coded with red and black. I'm guessing that they use red to describe the accessory organs, which doesn't make much sense because I would put the mouth as being black, but whatever. The pharynx and everything else, those are all part of the tract, and those are all colored black. Not going to be an image that you need to worry about for the exam because we'll have plenty others to look at. Now let's talk about the tract and its kind of structural makeup before we actually start getting into the different organs. Okay, so just like we learned in our previous lecture with the trachea, the wall of the GI tract is made up of 4 layers. Okay. Once again, the GI tract is just a complex tube from one end of the body to another, from the mouth to the anus. Okay. From our lower esophagus to the anal canal, there is the same basic 4-layered arrangement of tissues. And some of the names of these layers are the exact same names that we saw with the trachea. You have an inner mucosa surrounded by a submucosa, whereas with the trachea, we had a layer of cartilage. Here we have muscle, and then on the outside is serosa. That's, the last 2 layers are a little bit different, but the first 2 layers named exactly like the trachea had. Now, once again, this is from the lower esophagus to the anal canal. So essentially from about here down, but right here is not where the tract begins. Okay, the tract begins at the mouth. It includes the mouth, the pharynx, and then the upper and middle parts of the esophagus. So does that mean they don't have these 4 layers? Yes and no. They have some of them, but not all of them. Okay. But from the lower end of the esophagus, the rest of the way, they're always going to have these 4 layers. Okay. So we'll start by talking about the innermost layer. Same situation. We're going to go from inside out. The deepest layer, or innermost, is a mucosa, mucous membrane, which our mouth, the pharynx, and the upper and middle parts of our esophagus are going to have. Okay. The mucosa is actually 3 layers thick: a epithelium, or innermost layer, a middle layer of lamina propria, and then the muscularis mucosae, which is the outer layer, which is made up of smooth muscle. We can see those labeled here very nicely in our illustration. And the epithelium is very thin innermost. Then you got the middle, lamina propria, and then surrounding that is the muscularis mucosae. Okay. In the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the anal canal, the epithelium is mainly made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous, which serves as a protective function. There's simple columnar epithelium functioning in secretion and absorption in the stomach and the intestines. Located among those epithelial cells are exocrine cells, which secrete mucus and fluid into the lumen of the canal. You'll also find several types of endocrine cells known as enteroendocrine cells that secrete hormones. So in the case of the exocrine cells, they're going to produce substances that get released into the lumen. Okay, these are going to include mucus and other digestive substances. Whereas the endocrine cells, those are going to be releasing hormones, which are not going to get dumped into the lumen, but instead get dumped into the blood, because that's where hormones go. Okay. Now, the lamina propria of the mucosa, that middle layer, is composed of areolar connective tissue with many blood and lymphatic vessels, which are routes by which nutrients are absorbed. Okay. This layer also has the majority of cells of the mucosa associated lymphatic tissue, which we previously learned about, like those Peyer's patches that we talked about. Okay, those are the nodules that provide protection against disease. We can actually see a couple of them labeled here, and they're shown in green, just like we always use that color for the lymphatic system. And they're present along the canal, especially in the tonsils, the small intestine, the appendix, and in the large intestine. The muscularis mucosae throws the mucous membrane of the stomach and small intestines into many small folds, which increase its surface area for digestion and absorption. Movement of the muscle here ensures that all absorptive cells are fully exposed to the food in the canal. Therefore, it provides, for absorption, because that's what the absorptive cells do. As a whole, the mucosa is going to function to secrete mucus, as well as digestive enzymes and hormones. It also allows for absorption of the end products of digestion in the blood. And since it's got those MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, it helps protect against infectious diseases. Surrounding the mucosa is the submucosa, made up of areolar connective tissue with many blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, and nerve fibers. Okay. There's going to be a lot of glands in this layer, just like there's a lot of glands in the mucosa, and those glands are going to connect by way of ducts to the lumen. Now, to control the secretion of those glands, we have a network of neurons called the submucosal plexus, or plexus of Meissner, that's associated with this layer. Okay, this submucosal plexus, which is shown here in yellow, is what tells these glands to secrete or to stop secreting when, for example, like the small intestine is empty. We wouldn't want to be dumping juices in there if we're not, digesting anything. Okay. Surrounding that is the muscularis, which obviously, based on its name, is made up of muscle. Now, what type and how much muscle is dependent upon which part of the digestive system you're looking at. Okay. In the mouth and the pharynx, it's made up of skeletal muscle, which is important for swallowing. Okay. And this is very important because skeletal muscle, as we've previously learned about, is under voluntary control. And thus explains why we can mentally control when we move that food from our mouth down into the lower parts of our digestive tract. Okay. Now, from that act of swallowing, where we push that food into our throat, do we really have to think about anything and mentally control it at that point? No. Everywhere else, it's going to be smooth muscle. And that includes the stomach, where you actually have 3 layers. That's the only place where you have 3 layers. Everywhere else, you're going to have just 2 layers. Okay. And then in between those layers is another network of neurons, what we call the myenteric plexus. And the submucosal plexus controlled the secretion of these glands. Guess what this myenteric plexus controls? Contraction and relaxation of the muscle. So that's how the muscle knows when to contract and when to relax. It's nerve signals from that plexus. Okay. Finally, on the outside of the digestive system organs are the serosa, or is the serosa, serous membrane composed of areolar connective tissue, covered with a simple layer of simple squamous called mesothelium. Okay. Another name for this serosa is the visceral peritoneum because it forms a portion of the peritoneum. Peritoneum is very similar, and we're going to talk more about it on the next page, to the pleura and the pericardium that we just previously talked about. We talked about the pleura actually just about 20 minutes ago, which surrounds our lungs. The pericardium we learned about in our heart lecture surrounding our heart. Just like those 2 serous membranes, we talked about this peritoneum in our very first lecture of the semester. Now, your esophagus actually lacks the serosa and only contains that single layer of simple of areolar connective tissue called the adventitia. And now, I told you already, I mentioned that this is the small intestine. I can tell you that for a variety of reasons. Its shape, obviously, is pretty indicative of the small intestine. But also, you can see connected to the small intestine is what we call the mesentery, which is something we're going to talk about on the next page. I do want you to highlight some stuff in this image. I'll just kind of start here on the top and work clockwise. I guess it's counterclockwise. So highlight the submucosal plexus. You don't need to worry about the other term that's in parentheses. I want you to highlight the lumen, the mucosa in its 3 layers. Each layer, I want you to know. Highlight the submucosa, the muscularis, plus the circular and longitudinal muscle that's labeled. And then the serosa and its 2 layers. And then the myenteric plexus. Once again, just like with the submucosal plexus, you don't need to worry about the other term. Okay, so let's talk more about the serosa, the mesentery, and what we call the peritoneum here on this next page. Your peritoneum is the largest of the 3 serous membranes of the body. Okay? It consists of a layer of simple squamous epithelium, known as mesothelium, and an underlying supporting layer of areolar connective tissue. If I actually just do this, right there are those 2 layers labeled, although the epithelium is just labeled as epithelium and not the fancier name mesothelium. Okay? There are 2 parts to the peritoneum, just like there were 2 parts to the pleura, 2 parts to the pericardium. Parietal pleura or parietal peritoneum, visceral peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum is what lines the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas the visceral peritoneum is what covers some of the organs, not all of them, in their cavity, and is their serosa. Okay. If we were to do a dissection in this class, which we can't do since it's a hybrid and we do all the lab stuff online, if we were to actually dissect a human, or what I do on campus, since I have a physical lab, we dissect cats on them. Easiest way to view these abdominal organs is to do, I just call it like a zipper cut. Think like unzipping your jacket. That's essentially what we do. We cut from essentially down the throat, down to the groin, straight down, and then you can kind of just open up the abdomen. Just like if you unzip your coat, you can open up your coat, right? Well, just like the inner lining of your jacket, there's an inner lining of your abdominal pelvic cavity. That's what this parietal peritoneum essentially is. If I go back, yeah, you can't really see it because they've basically just removed, but you can see where like the skin and the muscle that's still there. You can kind of see right in here, this is the inner lining of that cavity. That would be the superficial parietal, and then you can kind of see these shiny membranes covering these organs. That would be the visceral. Okay. The slim space containing lubricating serous fluid is between those parietal and visceral portions, and we call this the peritoneal cavity. Okay. Some organs lie on the posterior abdominal wall and are actually covered by the peritoneum only on their anterior surfaces, meaning that they're not actually located in the peritoneal cavity at all. And these organs, therefore, are considered to be retroperitoneal, and that includes your kidneys, your ascending and descending large intestine, the duodenum, and the pancreas. In other words, these organs are so far back in your abdomen that they're covered by that visceral peritoneum, and so they're not inside the cavity at all, and that's where that retroperitoneal term comes from. Now, unlike the pericardium and the pleura, which cover the lungs and the heart respectively, the heart and lungs respectively, the peritoneum has large folds that weave between the viscera, the organs, binding them to one another and to the walls of the abdominal cavity. They also contain blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves that supply these abdominal organs. The 5 major peritoneal folds include one of the grossest things that we have, in my opinion, which is the greater omentum. This greater omentum is the largest peritoneal fold. It drapes over the transverse colon and coils of the small intestine like a fatty apron. Okay, essentially comes down from those and covers the majority of the organs down there in your belly. Okay, it is full of fat, and that's why it's described as a fatty apron. It's a double sheet that folds back on itself, and this is unfortunately what can expand greatly with weight gain, giving rise to that characteristic beer belly, as people like to describe it. Okay. We go back once again to this image. You can't see it because it's actually been removed, but you can kind of see a little bit of the fat still there, probably from just a little bit of remnant of it. It will be covering all this, just like it's covering it here, where it's actually not been removed. Okay. The falciform ligament, which has a fun name to say, is a fold that attaches the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. It runs vertically, forming 2 different lobes to the liver, a right lobe and a left lobe. You can see it here in a couple different images. It doesn't create equal halves to the liver. As you'll see, the right lobe is significantly larger than the left lobe of the liver, but it runs essentially right down the middle of the body. Your liver is more of a right side abdomen organ, but it is right there. We can actually also see a little bit right there. The lesser omentum arises as an anterior fold in the serosa of the stomach and the duodenum. It suspends the stomach and duodenum from the liver. It is visible right there, and you can only really see it in these 2 images. You can't really see it too much in the cadaver view. But that's associated with the stomach. The mesentery, which is what was shown here on this page, which is one of the reasons I knew that that was the small intestine. It's a fan-shaped fold of peritoneum binding the jejunum and the ileum of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. It is a very significant fold of the peritoneum. If you were to like try to pull out the small intestine, you wouldn't be able to pull it completely out because of that mesentery that's holding into that back wall. It's a really kind of shiny membrane. If you've ever, seen intestines of animals, you've seen it. And there's a lot of times, a lot of blood vessels are visible kind of in between it. Then finally, the mesocolon includes two separate folds of the peritoneum binding the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon of the large intestine. Similar to the mesentery, except mesocolon, anytime you see colon, that's got to deal with the large intestine. And so that's what the mesocolon helps to hold together. If I go to this page here, it would be right in this white area. It's not shown, but this is the large intestine kind of separated out. It would be there though. Here you can actually see the mesentery. I don't see the mesocolon label, but that's okay. Not a big deal. Any questions here? As far as these images go, don't really need to worry about them. And just make sure you know the information. Okay, what we're going to do is stop here. We'll start with the mouth, and that's where we really start to get into the fun part, where we start learning about the different organs and whatnot. And as you can see, the mouth is a pretty complicated structure, so we'll start fresh with that on Thursday.